The Ozark Mountains harbored a family whose biological foundation had crumbled from within. These were brothers who never ceased their internal decay. This isn't some whispered campfire tale passed down through generations. This represents documented reality. A family who deliberately remained hidden from society, buried deep within Arkansas's mountain terrain, where blood relations intertwined repeatedly across generations, producing something nature never intended. Spring 1947 found the Ozark Mountains standing sentinel over northwestern Arkansas like ancient protectors guarding mysteries best left undisturbed. Oak and hickory forests blanketed the hillsides in thick layers. Their branches formed canopies so dense that sunlight barely managed to penetrate to the forest floor. Morning mist lingered in the valleys, creating an eerie atmosphere that gave even the most experienced hunters pause before venturing deeper into the wilderness. This region embraced isolation not merely as geography, but as an entire existence. 15 miles from Marble Falls, the nearest settlement, tucked away in a remote hollow, sat the Hutchkins property, a collection of weather-worn structures dominated by a main house that hardly qualified for the name. Rotted wooden planks clung together through rusted nails alone. Rain found its way through the roof during every storm. Yellowed newspaper replaced glass in the windows. Smaller shacks dotted the surrounding clearing, each appearing more dilapidated than the previous one. A barn leaned dangerously to one side, its doors hanging from single hinges. The entire compound appeared to sink beneath the accumulated weight of its own deterioration. Elma Hutchkins, 63 years old and patriarch of this secluded clan, occupied the porch that morning, his weathered face telling stories of relentless hardship. His threadbare, stained clothing hung loosely from his thin frame. Beside him sat Martha, his wife and first cousin. Her eyes, which might have once sparkled with youth, now held an empty gaze that seemed to look past rather than at her surroundings. Their marriage had lasted 42 years, arranged by parents who saw nothing problematic about preserving bloodlines and retaining property within the family circle. The Hutchkins clan had inhabited this hollow for 4 generations, beginning in 1863 when Josiah Hutchkins, fleeing Confederate execution as a deserter, escaped into these mountains accompanied by his sister Rebecca. Together they founded what would become a dynasty of biological disaster. Their children intermarried. Those children's children followed the same pattern. By 1947, the family tree had transformed into a tangled mass of repeated names and closed genetic circuits. That particular morning, Martha's voice, roughened by decades of poverty and neglect, called out, "Boys, come out here." Her words echoed across the clearing, startling a flock of crows that erupted from nearby trees in a burst of harsh cries. 3 figures emerged from the largest shack, individuals whose appearance made even hardened mountain folk, who occasionally caught glimpses of them, turn away in horror. Vernon, 19, shuffled forward with an awkward gait, his legs bowed outward at unnatural angles, forcing a rocking motion with each step. His head appeared disproportionately large for his thin body, and his eyes sat at slightly different levels on his face. Behind him came Eugene, 17, whose spine curved in a severe S shape, creating a hunched appearance that made him seem perpetually ground-seeking. His arms hung at peculiar angles, one noticeably longer than the other. Finally came Raymond, 15, the youngest, whose developmental delays manifested in every movement. He walked with his mouth hanging open, a strand of saliva connecting his lower lip to his chest. These were the products of 5 generations of consanguineous unions. The Hutchkins family had unknowingly conducted a brutal human genetics experiment, and these boys represented living proof of nature's rebellion against such practices. Despite his physical limitations, Vernon possessed a sharp mind. He understood, in ways his brothers could not, their actual situation. 3 years earlier, he had discovered an old medical book in an abandoned cabin, and though reading challenged him, he had gathered enough information to comprehend what consanguinity meant. He understood why his body betrayed him with every step, why his younger brothers would never develop beyond young children's mental capacity. That morning, as the three brothers stood before their parents in the weak spring sunlight, Vernon noticed something different in his father's expression. Elmer's jaw was set, with the determination of someone who had made a decision. "County man coming tomorrow," Elmer said, his voice carrying the thick Ozark accent. "Got to check on you boys. Some new law about children needing schooling." Martha's vacant eyes suddenly focused with unusual intensity. "Ain't nobody taking my boys nowhere," she said, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that sent the crows fleeing again. Vernon felt his chest tighten. During their rare supply trips to Marble Falls, he had caught whispers about new government programs, social workers, institutions for people like his brothers. The word institution terrified him beyond anything else in his limited world. "What ain't going?" Vernon said, his words slightly slurred by a palate that had never formed correctly. "This is our home." Eugene produced a sound that might have indicated agreement, though his vocal cords had never developed properly for clear speech. Raymond simply stared at a beetle crawling across the porch, completely unaware of the conversation determining his fate. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the full extent of the Hutchkins' poverty. Thin, mangy chickens pecked at the barren dirt. A single emaciated cow occupied a pen constructed from whatever scrap wood could be scavenged. The vegetable garden, if it deserved the name, consisted of struggling potato plants and some wild onions. This represented the legacy of isolation and inbreeding. Not merely physical deformity and mental limitation, but crushing poverty resulting from a family too isolated for effective trade, too genetically compromised for efficient work, too ashamed for integration with the outside world. Thomas Whitfield arrived at Hutchkins Hollow at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late March 1947. His Ford sedan struggled up the rutted dirt road, branches scraping against the doors like skeletal fingers attempting to turn him back. At 34, Thomas served as Madison County's social welfare officer, a position created just 2 years earlier as part of post-war social reform initiatives. He had witnessed poverty before, had visited families living in conditions that would shock most Americans, but nothing prepared him for what awaited in this forgotten Ozark corner. The smell hit him first when he stepped from his car. A combination of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and rotting wood assaulted his senses, making him momentarily dizzy. He steadied himself against the car door, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his forehead. Despite the cool mountain air, Elmer Hutchkins stood on the porch, rifle held loosely in his right hand, not pointed at Thomas, but not exactly at rest either. The message was unmistakable: outsiders were unwelcome. "Mr. Hutchkins," Thomas called out, keeping his voice steady and professional. "I'm Thomas Whitfield from County Social Services. I sent a letter about my visit today." "Can't read," Elmer responded flatly. "And we don't need no government man poking around our business." Thomas had dealt with hostile families before. Patience was key. Along with making them understand, he came to help, not harm. "Sir, there's a new compulsory education law. All children between 7 and 16 must attend school. I'm here to help your boys get enrolled." "My boys ain't like other children," Elmer said, and for the first time, Thomas detected something besides hostility in the old man's voice. Was it shame? Fear? They stay here where they belong. Then Thomas saw them, Three young men emerged from behind the main house, and his professional composure nearly shattered. His University of Arkansas training had covered developmental disabilities, malnutrition, and various childhood diseases. But this was something else entirely. Something his textbooks had mentioned only in brief clinical terms. Vernon approached first, his asymmetrical gait creating a disturbing rhythm. Thomas noticed the enlarged cranium, the facial features seeming to slide off center, the way one eye tracked independently of the other. Eugene followed, his twisted spine forcing him to look upward at an angle, his uneven arms swinging in grotesque parody of normal movement. Raymond trailed behind, making nonsensical sounds, his coordination so poor that he stumbled over perfectly flat ground. Thomas had read about consanguinity in his medical anthropology courses. He knew the theoretical risks. Autosomal recessive disorders, increased homozygosity, the expression of deleterious alleles that would normally remain hidden in heterozygous populations. But seeing the human cost of such genetic catastrophe standing before him in the flesh created a visceral reaction no textbook could convey. Mr. Hutchins, Thomas said, choosing his words carefully, your sons need medical attention. There are new facilities, treatments that might help improve their quality of life. Quality of life. Elmer repeated the phrase as if tasting something bitter. They got life. That's more than some folks can say. We take care of our own. Vernon moved closer to Thomas, studying him with surprising intensity. You one of them doctors? He asked, his speech impaired but comprehensible. No, son. I'm a social worker, but I can arrange for doctors to see you and your brothers. Read about it, Vernon said, tapping his oversized head with a malformed finger. In a book. Said when kin marry kin, babies come out wrong. That's us, ain't it? We're the wrong babies. The stark self-awareness in Vernon's words hit Thomas harder than any medical diagnosis could have. This young man understood his own condition, comprehended the biological tragedy that had shaped his existence. Martha appeared in the doorway, her presence somehow making the scene even more disturbing. Thomas noticed the similarities between her features and Elmer's, the telltale signs of shared ancestry written in their bone structure and facial characteristics. How many generations? Thomas asked quietly, already knowing the answer would be horrifying. My great-grandparents were brother and sister, Elmer said with disturbing matter of factness. Kept the land in the family. Been Hutchins marrying Hutchins ever since. Thomas did the mental calculation. 5 generations of intensive inbreeding. The coefficient of inbreeding would be astronomical. Genetic diversity essentially eliminated. It was a miracle these boys had survived to adolescence. The state can provide care. Thomas offered special schools, medical treatment, a chance for your boys to have lives beyond this hollow. You mean lock them up? Vernon said, his voice sharp despite its impediment. Heard about them places where they put folks like us, where nobody never comes back from. He was not entirely wrong. The institutions of 1947 were often little better than warehouses for the developmentally disabled. Places where people were forgotten and left to deteriorate in overcrowded wards. Thomas had toured several such facilities during his training, and the memories still haunted his dreams. There are good facilities, Thomas insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Places where they can learn skills, receive proper nutrition, medical care. They got us, Martha said, her voice breaking. We ain't much, but we're family. That counts for something. Thomas spent 3 hours at the Hutchins compound that day. He documented everything, the living conditions, the boys' physical and mental states, the family history. He took photographs with his Kodak Brownie camera, though he knew the black and white images could never fully capture the tragic reality before him. Before he left, Vernon pulled him aside. "If we go to them places, do we stay together?" "Me and my brothers." Thomas wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but his integrity would not allow it. "Probably not, son. Different facilities for different levels of need." Vernon nodded slowly, as if this confirmed what he already knew. "Then we stay here. At least here we got each other." Driving away from the hollow, Thomas gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He had a report to write, recommendations to make. But what could he recommend? Forcing these young men into institutions that would separate them and provide minimal care, leaving them in poverty and isolation with parents who were themselves products of inbreeding. The science was clear. The Hutchins family had created a closed genetic system, repeatedly expressing recessive alleles causing skeletal deformities, neurological impairments, developmental delays, and organ malformations. Each generation had rolled the genetic dice and lost, compounding the damage until producing these three brothers who represented the ultimate consequence of biological isolation. But the human element was infinitely more complex than any genetic formula could express. Summer transformed the Ozark Hollow into a suffocating prison. Heat pressed down on the Hutchins compound like a physical weight, turning the ramshackle structures into ovens offering no relief, even at night. The drought of 1947 had been particularly brutal, turning what little fertile soil existed into cracked, barren earth. The single cow had died in June, its emaciated corpse dragged into the woods where vultures made quick work of it. The chickens had stopped laying eggs weeks ago, their bodies too stressed and malnourished to produce. Vernon sat in the shade of the leaning barn, watching his brothers attempt to dig for potatoes in the garden. Eugene's twisted spine made the work nearly impossible, and Raymond kept forgetting what he was doing, wandering off to examine insects or rocks until Vernon called him back. The sight filled Vernon with an emotion he had only recently learned to name despair. 3 months had passed since Thomas Whitfield's visit. True to his word, the social worker had returned twice, each time with more urgency in his voice, more concern in his eyes. But the Hutchins family had held firm. No government institution would take their boys. What Thomas did not know, what Vernon had only recently discovered, was that Elmer and Martha had made a different decision entirely. A decision rooted in the same twisted logic that had governed the family for generations. Vernon found the documents hidden in a coffee tin under his parents' bed. Marriage licenses. One for him and his cousin Sarah, daughter of Elmer's brother Jacob, who lived 20 miles west. One for Eugene and another cousin, Mary Beth. The dates were set for September, just 2 months away. The realization hit Vernon like a physical blow. His parents intended to continue the cycle. They would marry off their sons to more Hutchins women, produce another generation of genetically compromised children, perpetuate the nightmare indefinitely. That night, Vernon did something he had never done before. He walked the 3 miles to the nearest neighbor, old Dutch Henderson, who lived in a cabin by Silver Creek. Dutch was 70 years old, a hermit who had fought in the First World War and wanted nothing to do with society afterward. But he was also the only person within walking distance who owned a telephone. Need to call that county man? Vernon told Dutch, his words coming out in a rush despite his speech impediment. They're going to make us marry our cousins. Going to make more babies like us. Got to stop it. Dutch studied Vernon's face in the lamplight. You know what calling him means, boy. They'll take you away from here. You'll never see this hollow again. I know, Vernon said, and for the first time in his 19 years, he felt something like hope. Better than making more of us. Better than watching new babies come out wrong because we too stupid or scared to break the chain. The call was made. Thomas Whitfield arrived the next morning with a sheriff's deputy and a doctor from the state health department. What followed was a scene that would be remembered in Madison County for decades. Martha fought like a cornered animal, screaming and clawing as they tried to explain the legal situation. Elmer stood silent, his rifle finally put down, defeated by a world that had moved beyond the isolated rules of the hollow. Eugene wailed in confusion, not understanding why strangers were packing their few belongings into boxes. Raymond simply sat on the ground, playing with a piece of string, oblivious to the fact that his entire world was being dismantled around him. Vernon stood apart from it all, watching with an expression that mixed grief and relief in equal measure. He had betrayed his family to save his family. It was a paradox he would spend the rest of his life trying to reconcile. The examination by the state doctor, conducted in the back of a specially equipped van, confirmed what Thomas had suspected. All three brothers showed signs of severe genetic disorders consistent with multi-generational consanguinity. Vernon had a congenital heart defect that would likely kill him before age 30. Eugene's spinal deformities were causing organ compression that created chronic pain and breathing difficulties. Raymond's neurological development had stopped at approximately age 5 and would never progress further. These boys are medical miracles in the worst sense. The doctor told Thomas privately. That they survived childhood is remarkable. That they can function at all is extraordinary. But their genetics are a nightmare. I've identified at least 7 distinct recessive disorders. Probably more once we do comprehensive testing. As the sun set on that August day, the Hutchkins brothers were loaded into a state vehicle for transport to separate facilities. Vernon to a group home for hire, functioning disabled adults in Little Rock. Eugene to a medical facility in Fayetteville that could manage his physical complications. Raymond to an institution in Fort Smith that specialized in severe developmental disabilities. Before the car pulled away, Vernon turned to look at the hollow one last time. His mother sat on the porch, still screaming curses at the government men who had stolen her children. His father stood in the doorway, a broken man, staring at the ruins of his dynasty. The land that had been Hutchkins' property for 84 years would eventually be absorbed by the National Forest. The structures left to collapse into the earth. Physical evidence of a biological experiment that should never have occurred. At that moment, as Vernon's tears finally fell, streaming down his asymmetrical face, I want you to pause and think about the courage it took for him to break a cycle that had lasted generations. In the comments, type exactly what Vernon whispered to himself as the car drove away. No more wrong babies. Let that phrase remind you of the power one person has to stop a legacy of suffering. The Little Rock Group Home for Special Needs Adults occupied a converted warehouse in an industrial section of the city, surrounded by factories and rail yards. Vernon arrived on a September evening in 1947, his few possessions contained in a single cloth bag. The building stood 3 stories of brick and wire mesh windows designed more for containment than comfort. Inside, 43 residents lived in dormitory-style rooms supervised by a staff of 7 working rotating shifts. The director, Margaret Chen, was a second-generation Chinese-American who had studied social work in California before moving to Arkansas with her husband. She was one of the few administrators in the state who actually cared about her charges as human beings rather than case numbers. Vernon's intake examination revealed the full extent of his medical complications. Beyond the obvious skeletal deformities and facial asymmetry, rays showed his heart had 3 chambers instead of 4. His left kidney was missing entirely, and his liver was approximately 60% normal size. That he had survived to 19 was, as multiple doctors noted, medically improbable. "You're a fighter," Margaret told him during their first meeting. "Your body tried everything to stop you from living, but here you are anyway." Vernon appreciated her directness. Most people either spoke to him like a child or avoided speaking to him at all. "How long I got?" he asked bluntly. "The doctors say 5 to 7 years, maybe less, but doctors have been wrong before." Life in the group home was regimented. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work assignments from 8 to noon, lunch, more work until 5, dinner, free time until lights out at 9. The work consisted of simple assembly tasks contracted from local companies: sorting buttons, packaging soap, folding cardboard boxes. It was monotonous but purposeful, and Vernon threw himself into it with desperate intensity. He made few friends. Most of the residents had cognitive impairments that limited communication. But there was Robert, a 30-year-old man with cerebral palsy whose mind was sharp even though his body betrayed him with constant tremors. They would sit together in the common room during free time, Robert teaching Vernon to read better. Vernon listening to Robert's stories about the war he had followed obsessively through radio broadcasts. 200 miles north in Fayetteville, Eugene's experience was far grimmer. The medical facility where he had been placed was overcrowded and understaffed. His spinal curvature required constant pain management, but medication was expensive and often unavailable. He spent most days lying on a thin mattress in a ward with 30 other patients, his world reduced to water, stained ceiling tiles, and the sounds of suffering around him. Eugene could not speak clearly enough to communicate his needs. The staff, overwhelmed and poorly trained, often ignored him unless he became disruptive. His one pleasure was a radio that played country music. The sounds of guitars and mournful voices, his only connection to anything beyond pain and loneliness. He thought about Vernon and Raymond constantly. Were they together? Were they safe? His limited understanding could not process the concept that they had been separated, possibly forever. In his mind, they were just in another room, and eventually someone would take him to where they were waiting. Raymond's fate was perhaps the saddest of all. The Fort Smith Institution, officially called the Arkansas Home for the Feeble-Minded, was a holding facility for the state's most severely disabled citizens. Over 300 people lived there in conditions that would later be condemned as inhumane. Raymond, incapable of basic self-care, was placed in the lowest functioning ward, where residents spent their days in a large room with concrete floors and barred windows. The staff kept him clean and fed, but there was no education, no stimulation, no attempt to improve his quality of life. He existed, nothing more. The boy who had spent his days in the Ozark Hollow chasing butterflies and picking wildflowers now sat in a corner rocking back and forth, occasionally making the nonsensical sounds that were his only form of expression. Back in Little Rock, Vernon received his first letter in October. Thomas Whitfield, still checking on the brothers he had helped remove from the hollow, wrote to update him on Eugene and Raymond's situations. The news was not good. Eugene's health was declining rapidly. Raymond had developed a respiratory infection that might prove fatal given his compromised immune system. Vernon made a request to Margaret Chen that seemed impossible. He wanted to see his brothers, all three of them, together, one last time. The facilities are hundreds of miles apart. Margaret explained gently. The cost, the logistics, your health conditions. I'm dying anyway. Vernon interrupted. Doctors said so. Just want to see my brothers before they go. We're all that's left of the Hutchkins family. The real ones, I mean, the ones who didn't ask to be born wrong. Margaret Chen spent 3 weeks making calls, filling out paperwork, calling in favors. In December 1947, she accomplished what seemed impossible. All 3 brothers would be brought to Little Rock for a supervised visit on Christmas Day. The reunion took place in the group home's common room, decorated with paper snowflakes and a small artificial tree. Vernon sat in a wheelchair now, his heart condition making walking difficult. Eugene was carried in on a stretcher, his spine having curved so severely that he could no longer sit upright. Raymond was led in by 2 orderlies, his gait unsteady, his eyes unfocused. For a moment, the brothers simply looked at each other. Then Raymond, who recognized almost nothing anymore, saw Vernon's face and made a sound of pure joy. He shuffled forward and collapsed against Vernon's wheelchair, wrapping his arms around his oldest brother with surprising strength. Eugene, unable to move much, simply wept. Tears ran down his twisted face and soaked into the stretcher beneath him. Vernon held Raymond with one arm and reached out to touch Eugene's hand with the other. "We made it," he said, his voice breaking. "We got out of the hollow. We broke the chain. No more wrong babies after us." Margaret Chen watched from the doorway, her professional composure crumbling. She had seen many sad cases in her career, but something about these 3 brothers, destroyed by generations of genetic recklessness, yet still finding connection in their shared suffering, broke through her carefully maintained emotional distance. They spent 4 hours together. They could not do much. Raymond would not let go of Vernon. Eugene could only listen and occasionally squeeze Vernon's hand. But they were together, and for that brief window of time, the Hutchins brothers were a family again. As the orderlies prepared to take Eugene and Raymond back to their respective facilities, Vernon pulled Margaret aside. "When I die," he said matter-of-factly, "I want them to know. And I want them to know I loved them. That even though we were born wrong, what we felt for each other was right. I promise," Margaret said, and she meant it. Vernon Hutchins died on March 3, 1952, at 3:17 in the morning. His malformed heart, which had beaten against impossible odds for 24 years, finally surrendered. He died in his sleep at the Little Rock Group home. His last words, spoken to Margaret Chen hours earlier: "Tell my brothers I went peaceful. Tell them the chain is broken." Eugene received the news at the Fayetteville Medical Facility. By then, his condition had deteriorated to the point where he was bedridden permanently. His spine had curved so severely that his rib cage pressed against his internal organs, making every breath an effort. When the social worker told him about Vernon's death, Eugene made a sound that might have been crying, or might have been his labored breathing. It was impossible to tell. He died 17 days later. The official cause was respiratory failure, but those who cared for him believed he had simply given up. Without Vernon, without the anchor of his oldest brother's presence somewhere in the world, Eugene had no reason to continue fighting. Raymond lived longer than anyone expected. The Fort Smith Institution kept him alive through basic care and medical intervention when infections threatened. But he never developed beyond the mental capacity of a young child. He never understood that his brothers were gone, that he was the last of the Hutchins line. In his limited awareness, they were simply somewhere else, and eventually someone would take him to where they waited. He died in 1961 at age 29, pneumonia claiming him during a particularly harsh winter. With his death, the Hutchins family genetics came to their final conclusion. No children, no continuation, no further victims of a biological experiment spanning 5 generations. The Hutchins Hollow in the Ozarks had long since been abandoned. Elmer died in 1950, Martha in 1953. Both were buried in unmarked graves on their property. The buildings collapsed under the weight of weather and neglect, eventually becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. By the 1960s, hikers occasionally stumbled upon the ruins, not knowing the tragedy that had unfolded there. Thomas Whitfield continued his work as a social welfare officer until his retirement in 1975. He kept detailed records of the Hutchkins case, recognizing its importance as a cautionary tale about genetic isolation and the consequences of consanguinity. His files would later be studied by medical researchers and geneticists, contributing to understanding of how inbreeding affects human populations. Margaret Chen used the Hutchkins brothers' story in her advocacy work for better treatment of disabled citizens. She testified before state legislative committees, arguing for improved funding and conditions in care facilities. The image of three brothers, destroyed by their families' genetic choices, yet still showing love and loyalty to each other, became a powerful argument for human dignity regardless of physical or mental limitations. The scientific legacy of the Hutchkins family is documented in medical literature. Studies of their genetic material, preserved from blood samples taken during their institutionalization, revealed a coefficient of inbreeding of 0.4375, meaning nearly 44% of their genome was homozygous due to shared ancestry. This level of inbreeding is almost never seen in human populations and resulted in the expression of numerous recessive disorders simultaneously. Researchers identified the specific mutations that cause their deformities, a defect in the COL2A1 gene causing skeletal abnormalities, mutations in the NPC1 gene affecting neurological development, and variants in the GAIDA4 gene responsible for Vernon's cardiac malformations. Each brother carried these mutations in homozygous form, guaranteeing their expression. But beyond the science, beyond the genetic formulas and medical terminology, the Hutchkins brothers represent something more profound. They were human beings who suffered not because of their own choices, but because of decisions made generations before their birth. They were victims of a system, both familial and social, that valued isolation and tradition over biological reality. Vernon's final act, calling for intervention despite knowing it would end his family's way of life, was an act of profound moral courage. He chose the pain of separation and institutionalization over allowing the cycle to continue. He chose to be the last generation of wrong babies, as he called them, even though it cost him everything familiar. The three graves in Little Rock's Potter's Field contained the bodies of Vernon, Eugene, and Raymond Hutchkins. They were buried there because no family claimed them, because the state had no funds for proper funerals, because they died as they lived, invisible to most of the world. But their headstones, simple concrete markers installed by Margaret Chen using her own money, read, "Brothers born of unfortunate circumstance, died with dignity intact." In the decades since their deaths, advances in genetics have made the Hutchkins case even more relevant. We now understand inbreeding depression, the role of genetic diversity in population health, and the specific mechanisms by which consanguinity causes harm. The Hutchkins brothers are cited in textbooks, studied in medical schools, referenced in policy discussions about genetic counseling. But they were not case studies. They were Vernon, who taught himself to read despite a malformed brain. They were Eugene, who found joy in country music, even as his body twisted in on itself. They were Raymond, who never understood his tragedy, but loved his brothers with pure, uncomplicated devotion. Their story reminds us that genetics is not just about DNA sequences and inheritance patterns. It is about human lives shaped by biological reality. It is about the consequences of decisions that echo through generations. It is about the cruelty of nature when we violate its fundamental rules. The Hutchkins Hollow is gone now, reclaimed by the Ozark wilderness. Young trees grow where the house once stood. Wildflowers bloom in what was once the struggling garden. Nature has healed itself, erasing the evidence of the family that tried to exist outside its laws. But the story remains. The brothers of the ruined bacteria in the Ozarks. Boys who never stopped consuming inside. Consumed not by supernatural forces or mysterious illnesses, but by the accumulated genetic damage of 5 generations of inbreeding. They were born into a trap set long before their conception, and they died having broken that trap for any who might have come after. If you have made it to this point in their story, you understand why channels like this exist. To tell the truth about human tragedy, to honor those who suffered in obscurity, to learn from the past so we do not repeat its mistakes. Subscribe to this channel because these forgotten stories deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who truly cares about preserving these important histories. Like this video if you believe the Hutchins brothers deserved better than what genetics and isolation gave them. Share it so others can understand the real cost of genetic isolation and the courage it takes to break generational cycles of suffering. The brothers are gone, but their story, their sacrifice, their love for each other despite everything must not be forgotten.